I'm Helen Mills, the Head of Programmes for the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies. Welcome to this webinar on short prison sentences. In the next minute or so, I can see that those of you in the waiting room are just filtering through to join us and people are logging on. So whilst that's happening, I just want to tell you a little bit about today's event. The purpose of our webinar today is to explore the options, pitfalls and opportunities for reforming short prison sentences. Those signed up for today's event are going to take us the length of Great Britain. So to the south, welcome to those of you hopefully joining us today from Brighton Women's Centre, and to the north, those of you joining us from Loch Ascent in the far northwest of Scotland. And to our other attendees this morning, the vast majority of whom are somewhere between those 2 points, welcome. This spread in geography bodes really well for our discussion this morning. I'm delighted it's going to be drawing on our collective experiences in both Scotland and England and Wales. In both jurisdictions, the use of short prison sentences and that they are problematic has been firmly on the agenda in recent years. And a desire to change this use has spurred a number of reforms in both places. Perhaps most obviously, in Scotland, since 2011, a presumption against short sentences has been introduced. And last year that was extended to a presumption against prison sentences of up to a year. This is an important aspect of our discussion today. There's an obvious interest from those of us south of the border in the Scottish experience of the presumption, in the developments themselves, whether they had any impact in practice, and the wider reflections that they've generated. It's also not our only focus. I hope this morning will be a dialogue between us, because there are shared unresolved questions for us all about how reforming short sentences can best be done, about what success looks like, what we know and don't know about how changes can meaningfully be achieved in practice, and what the current context we find ourselves in might mean for the prospects and opportunities around the use of short prison sentences in the future. For the Centre this morning is one of a number of ongoing activities that myself and colleagues are involved in around the reform of short prison sentences. We're grateful to the Lloyds Bank Foundation for supporting this work. We have a great panel to kick off the discussion this morning, and I'm delighted to be introducing them. I'm going to be introducing them individually, and I just want to say a couple of things about the format. Our speakers have each agreed to speak for around 8 minutes, which I know is a challenge, and that said that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if I could ask you to please post your questions and answers using that Q&A function that you'll find towards the bottom of your screen. As well as posting questions, you can upvote questions that other people have posted, and what that will do is move them up the list, and that will make it more likely that they'll then be asked. I'd ask you not to use the chat function, which is also at the bottom of your screen, for questions. We won't be able to necessarily see everything that's posted there, but we will be keeping a good eye on the Q&A function. So this event is for 1.5 hours. We're due to finish at 11 o'clock. A recording of it is being made, and it will be uploaded and available on our website in due course. I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Kenny MacAskill. Kenny is MP for East Lothian. He's a member of the Justice Select Committee, but most relevantly for our purposes today, he is the former Secretary for Justice in the Scottish Government who introduced a presumption against short prison sentences. Kenny, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll do my best to explain the journey that we're on in Scotland and where I think we've got to. But let me start with my own background. I had been a defence agent, so I knew about prisons and those involved in offending. It didn't come as a surprise to me, but I also had some time out when I was a politician before I became the Shadow Justice Minister. What it meant was that when we were elected to government in 2007, I hit the ground running. I had been meeting with people. I'd already formed my own view that there was no good reason in Scotland that we have more people locked up than our Celtic cousins, or indeed most other countries in Western Europe. We're not bad people. There are issues with drink and a culture of violence, but we're addressing them, and we had to address them as a government. But locking people up was just something that was being done routinely. Having been in opposition, it was also an opportunity for me to be briefed. And Professor Andrew Coyle Cyrus, who we'll be hearing about, Bill White, another professor, were all pivotal in formulating my own ideas. When, elected to government, it'd be fair to say that the civil service asked what we wanted to do when we told them that we wanted a coherent penal policy that would see people who needed to be locked up detained, and those who didn't need to be dealt with other ways. They got to it and set to it with a will. So the legislation on having a presumption against prison sentences actually tied in also with bringing in the new community payback order, because there had to be an alternative way of selling it. So that was the background. It was a personal conviction, but it was also a political necessity, because it'd be fair to say that in the first few years of my political office, prison numbers, which are coming back on the political agenda, were a real problem. We were going above capacity, and it was only down to, I think, the willingness of the Prison Officers Association, who I remain eternally grateful to, being prepared to work on, that they didn't say that they were not prepared to take any more prisoners, but they did a remarkable job. But we had far too many people in. Equally, it has to be said, anybody who thinks it's, I think most people listening into this will be well aware, anybody who thinks that reducing the prison sentence will reduce the numbers hugely is limited, because the change that we brought in 2011 was meant to be for 6 months, but we couldn't persuade the Liberal Democrats, and we were a minority government at that time and required support. Couldn't persuade them to come on board, so it only came in for 3 months. So the numbers that actually affected were very few, because, to be fair to the Scottish Judiciary, not many people were getting sentences of 3 months or less. There were some, but with actions on debt and non-payment of fines, it was being dealt with other ways. So in some ways, it was much more symbolic. We'd always wanted to go further, and I'm glad that my successor has now put it up to a year. There was support from the Senior Judiciary. The difficulties have always been that it's not the Senior Judiciary who actually deal with people who get sentenced to 3 months, 6 months, or even less than a year. It's invariably the Shrieval bench, or it would be magistrates or other circuit judges in England. And there can be differences there. What was also important were changes that came in Scotland at the time, and where became much more. I don't normally support a huge amount of centralisation and direction, but at one stage this idea that every sheriff was entirely independent and could do what they wanted and didn't have to go to training, didn't have to do this or that, was entirely unacceptable. And the changes that have been brought in by previous Lord Presidents to make sure that they step up to the mark have been remarkable. It would also be fair to say, I think, who's coming through as sheriffs are different now than before. And I also have to say that the training given by the judicial studies is actually really quite remarkable. It's very, very good in Scotland. I don't know the situation in England, but I have to say what Alistair Duff and other experts brought in terms of training sheriffs and trying to move them away and trying to get them into problem solving. That said, it doesn't mean that everything has been solved, because clearly 3 months is pretty inadequate. There were a few recalcitrant sheriffs who just took the view, what does the government know? I have to deal with these people. Thankfully, most of them are beginning to retire, and those, as I say, coming through are much better. There was good logic, and we had to sell it to the public, and selling it to the public was partly of why we had community payback orders. I did have a rhetoric, some of which I don't feel proud of, but why do we want to lock people up who commit offences when we could be having them out paying back by the sweat of their brow? That frequently wasn't the case, especially for female offenders who were deeply troubled, but you needed that to try and perhaps sell it to the public in short radio interviews. Why don't we just lock them all up? Because why would you want to have the most expensive method that doesn't actually deliver any success? Because it's quite clear that community payback orders were much more successful in people not reoffending than prison sentences. So there was a lot of rhetoric. It tied in with, as I say, trying to be seen to be tough on crime, but by doing community payback. And a lot of good work was done by civil servants in getting community buy-in, where you know, the older days of bad boy or bad girl does good work is always popular. I do remember going to speak to the editor of The Sun in Scotland, who was impressed by this and was prepared to sign up for it if I put them all in orange jumpsuits, to which I said, well, if you could show me the evidence that putting them all in orange jumpsuits would work, as opposed to telling you where to get off and what to do with your jumpsuit, I would be prepared to consider it. He didn't, and he didn't support the policy, but I think the policy's actually worked, because community payback schemes, there's a lot of communities in Scotland have benefited for it, and equally, I think it always came back to my own view at the outset. This idea that people are retributive, that the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or other tabloids would have us, they aren't. Most communities are perfectly aware of who needs to be locked up, who's actually a very sad case, who's just been stupid and needs, you know, dealt with and has to just straighten up. So I think, you know, what we managed to get there was right. How is it affected in Scotland? Well, the numbers have been marginal, but I think, you know, the ability, you know, to move to 1 year without, you know, the world coming to an end shows that people have recognised that actually locking people up isn't the best way. There was some turbulence along the way, and it's probably relevant to situations south of the border at the moment, because we did have a knife crime issue. It's not entirely gone away, but it was major at one moment, with far too many young men dying in Scotland and calls for mandatory sentences of 6 months, then 2 years or whatever else. We had to hold the line about that. So some of it's about just having the political courage to hold the line. Here in Scotland at the moment, it's in a better place. I think the public accept that, you know, prison should be for those who have to go to prison, not for those who just commit offences that can be dealt with in other ways. It's very, very expensive. Building prisons isn't the way to go, especially when you can be and need to be building schools, houses, hospitals, or whatever. Prison numbers are sadly rising again in Scotland. Some of that remains the perennial problem about poverty and how we address things. Equally, I think changes made that I disagree with on ending automatic early release. The government has to accept the consequences of their actions. I disagreed with that, and they're paying a price now. But, you know, the whole ethos in Scotland, I think what can show to the south of the border is, you know, it's not the end of the world to persuade people who I think are open to it, especially in the communities who actually suffer from crime, not the communities who think they suffer from crime but don't actually, that people shouldn't routinely be going to prison for the default. The Senior Judiciary sign up for it. The difficulty is lower down. We've never made it absolutely mandatory. It is obviously discretionary and it's open to that. It's very difficult, I think, for a minister to overcome that. But certainly in Scotland, the Senior Judiciary are there. Those training the judiciary are on script. And I think they just have to continue to do that. But if it isn't working and sheriffs continue to flout it, then you ultimately have to make it mandatory. But that would be for others to decide upon and advise upon. But that's the background. I think I'm conscious that there's others with much more expert detail to say. It can be done. It should be done. It's not politically unpopular because actually you speak to people in the communities that suffer most, they know who needs to go to prison, and it's not those that are going in for short sentences. They at most are a nuisance, but they know who they are and they know what the problems are. So my view in south of the border would be get on and do it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kenny. Really great to have your candor and insight as someone who is obviously had to take on board the whole spectrum of issues that the debate around short prison sentences touches on. And I'm sure there will be many of our attendees here today who have particular experience and expertise in lots of things that you've spoken about. So I'm aware you talked quite a bit about community justice social work in Scotland, and we have people joining us from that field. I'd be really interested in what you're making of the developments there, what impact the presumptions had for you. Perhaps Kenny, I'm aware we maybe just have maybe 1 minute more of your time. You're brilliant at keeping to time. I wanted to ask you a question about what it was like at the time around resourcing the changes that you were looking to make. I'm aware at the time that around 2011 was a time of austerity, and that was kind of very much kind of coming in at the time, and must have been quite a daunting prospect as a minister to be both balancing the books while seeking to make some quite significant structural changes. And is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, in some ways, I mean, it's the cheapest option is to deal with community payback. It's significantly cheaper, and we were facing other issues, but rolling back the private democratisation of prisons was important. That got the loyalty of the prison service. But it, you know, at the end of the day, building more prisons, which was the only alternative, was much, much more expensive. So there was an economic driver in moving towards community payback and community sentences. So the money isn't the issue; it's the political will that matters. You know, because anybody looking at it, and I'm sure Treasury officials down south will say, you can either punish them in the community at a fraction of the rate, or you can build more prisons. So it's the same now as it was then. The expensive option is the default option of locking everybody up. And I have to say, I always found the argument in communities, if people challenged you about why you're being soft-touch justice or whatever, well, would you rather have homes, schools and hospitals, or do you want new prisons? Communities given that choice will say, we'll take the community facilities, thank you very much. So it's never put that way, but if you do put it that way, the public goes with you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Cyrus is a professor at Strathclyde University. Many of you will know his work around sentencing and considering sentencing in the context of wider penal policy. Cyrus, thank you. I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, thanks, Helen. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm delighted to be with you, and thanks to CCJS, Helen, Richard and the team for organising this session. My pitch is for a long-term agenda, and for those of us who have been thinking about criminal justice, as many of you have, and I've seen the list, we've got a great range of people here today. Many of us have been thinking about this for many decades, and it's really a pitch, I suppose, for the next 15, 20 years. And I'm going to make the argument that in order to really move away from prison as our kind of central idea, our central kind of cultural focus in our kind of penal imagination, we need a target date. And a target date probably of something like 2035. And I'm going to suggest a couple of principles that would enable us as a society to move forward towards that. It's not something I pretend can be done overnight, but how do we, as so many of us have been trying to do, shift the center of gravity from imprisonment as a kind of default option to community, and especially community services, because we know so many of the people who end up on short sentences are actually people with quite chronic needs. And simply to kind of dump those problems at the door of the criminal justice system is simply the wrong way of going about things. So how do we do that? I should say as well, therefore, and I do want to emphasize this to those of you who are practitioners, some of you will be judicial sentencers, social workers, probation, defense, prosecution. My kind of target of critique, if you like, is not you. This is about how we move ahead as a society. It's a collective issue. I suppose my target of critique is successive governments, if you like. This is a collective matter. What I'm going to try to do is show you a few slides. I hope this works. Can you see that? Yes, good. And okay. Okay, so I've titled this Ending the Default to Prison, Why Last Resort Must Go. The term last resort, many of you will be familiar with, the idea that prison should be the last resort. And that's an idea that we've used for a while. And I'm going to suggest that the presumption actually, as courageous as the attempts have been, actually the presumption still falls within that same thinking. So where do we go for the way ahead? Here's a little quiz to start us off. We've been talking about the need not to use prison for people who are, if you like, non-dangerous, non-violent, who can be dealt with in the community and whose needs can be addressed in the community. Who said this? Those of you who have been around a while might recognize this word. So anybody spot this? Use prison as we should use prison as sparingly as possible. It may be inevitable for violent offenders. We must question whether short periods of custody are appropriate. That quote appeared in the Howard Journal. Anybody know? It was this guy, Malcolm Rifkind, a kind of liberal, conservative politician, 40 years ago, in 1980, at the start of the Thatcher government. And that idea, if you like, of last resort wasn't new. Here's what he also said: we should make it more unlikely that the use of prison is used except as a last resort by the courts. The courts are now encouraged to regard prison as the last resort. People should only go there where there's nothing else for them. Sounds progressive. Along comes a SNP administration in Scotland, and increasingly looking to Nordic countries and arguing for a more kind of social democratic, inclusive society, and wanting to move away from high levels of imprisonment. And people like Kenny, who's on the panel, I'm delighted to be on the panel with him, I think deserve real credit for having the courage to say, and I think he was pretty effective, in making the argument both to his party and to the public, look, we don't need to use prison as much as we do, and setting his face against not only private prisons, but also refusing really to build a lot more prison infrastructure or more prisons. So how did things work out in terms of the presumption? And as Kenny said, he was in a minority government at the time, so obviously had real limitations on what he could do. What does the presumption say? What's the legislation say? It's the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act 2010. And section 10 is the crucial one. A court must not pass a sentence of imprisonment for a term of, now at the time, 3 months, but as mentioned, that got extended 12 months recently, unless the court considers that no other method of dealing with the person is appropriate. Sounds radical. Of course, all legislation, and rightly so, has caveats and has its exceptions. And this is certainly has its exception. But you'd be hard pushed probably to find a caveat which is more permissive than that. After all, what's it saying here? It's saying that a sentencing judge should not pass a prison sentence unless the sentencing judge thinks that it's appropriate to do so. And I'd ask you kind of rhetorically, who in everyday life makes a significant decision which they consider to be inappropriate? And indeed, which sentencing judge would pass a sentence which they consider to be inappropriate? So in a sense, what it's saying is, don't do this unless you think you should do it. So at best, the legislation was really going to be exhortation, and I suggested this at the time, while also understanding the kind of political limitations that were in place then. And of course, that presumption has been extended recently. But the presumption in terms of 3 months, what impact did it have? Kenny mentioned that it may have had only a marginal impact. And indeed, in 2015, the government published its own evaluation, and it found that the 3-month presumption had little impact on sentencing decisions. I have to say I was unsurprised by that. And one of the sheriffs who we spoke to as part of that said this, and I think it really gets to the nub of the problem. Really, when I'm imposing short prison sentences, that's when we run out of ideas, when I've run out of ideas. Now, that sentencing judge was absolutely within the legislation. What he or she was saying was, unless I could come up with anything else, it was going to be prison. And that's essentially what the presumption says. If you can find something else, great, but if not, if nothing else is appropriate, then it's prison. And this is really the problem, I think, with the presumption, is that it in fact falls within more than 4 decades of thinking in which it's said that prison should be, quotes, the last resort. Now, it's not only governments, it's Soft international law uses this. Many countries use the idea of last resort in their legislation. England and Wales does, and many NGOs do say, in fact, what they want is prison as the last resort. However, I think the problem with that is it puts the onus on so-called alternatives to prove themselves. If nothing else seems to be robust enough, then the default's prison. So you have to show that everything else is credible. Something else other than prison is credible. Something else other than prison will work. And if you don't think it will, then it's prison. So prison becomes the default. So last resort effectively collapses to become prison as the default option. When nothing else seems to work, it's prison. Prison is always there as the fail-safe, really in a society in which, where community justice and community services fail, prison is always there as the kind of reliable safety net, as the last line of the welfare state. And arguably, in fact, even if you look at the figures, we haven't come that much further from Victorian times, when we would now recognise that Victorians used prison as the kind of poorhouse. Arguably, we still do that in terms of short sentences and less serious offenders. I don't blame individual judges or practitioners for that, I must stress. This is a collective matter, because where the services don't seem to be there in the community, we end up using imprisonment. The danger, therefore, is, in Scotland, we've been talking about improved rehabilitation, and that's a good thing in prison. And in England and Wales, they're talking about investing large sums in prison. So where you've got a situation in which we're talking about improved prisoner rehabilitation, coupled with cuts to community justice, and especially community services on which we rely to address people's chronic needs, often poverty-related needs, and addiction, housing problems, homelessness, and so on. What you end up then is that more needy people are sucked into prison for their poverty-related needs. And that's not a deliberate choice. That's not something most practitioners want to see happen, but they often feel they are faced with no alternative. This is a collective matter. So I think the problem with this is that last resort as well not only becomes the default, but it allows governments to blame individual professionals. It kind of allows them to say, well, professionals have got discretion, but actually that discretion becomes a kind of hollow virility symbol in which the individual professional has to take on the whole burden of, if you like, collective problems of deprivation and poverty, addiction, housing, homelessness, and so on, and deal with that through the criminal justice system. And they know most of the time that's impossible with many of these people who aren't a danger to society. So, what should be done? I've got a couple of proposals really to put to you. And that is to say we should flip the idea of prison as the last resort, and that instead prison should have to justify itself, not so-called alternatives. So we should drop or invert the last resort. Prison must be justified, not its alternatives. Please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that rehabilitation isn't important in prison, it is, but prisons shouldn't be used as a place to send people for their needs, to help them with their needs, only if the seriousness of their offending justifies it. So prisoner rehabilitation, of course, is good for people who need to be there, but prisons should only be used if required by their offending. And we know that in practice, and this is not a critique of individual judges and practitioners, but we know that we do use prison, in fact, because people's needs can't be met properly in the community. So here's what I'd like to suggest, a two-part principle. And we need to as a society, whether it be 2035 or whatever. And that target, if you like, you could think of as akin to a kind of climate change target, in order to concentrate minds, policy minds, to really shift resources. And that we say by that date, we will say that imprisonment can only be used if warranted by the seriousness of offending. And furthermore, that rehabilitation, or if you like, help to address people's needs, should be excluded as a ground for recommending, suggesting, or passing a custodial sentence. Obviously, serious offenders, if they can therefore be rehabilitated in prison, that's great, but nobody should be going to prison in order to, in a sense, address their needs for want of services in the community. So I hope I've set out a kind of vision, if you like, a long-term vision for getting rid of a principle, last resort, which sounds so progressive, but in fact ends up being the default. And a final quick plug, I've set this out a little bit more in the last chapter of my recent book, Sentencing a Social Process. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Cyrus. Great that we've ended there on such a clear proposal that I'm sure those of us who are joining us today will be really interested in hearing possibly some more about in the Q&A. I know we've had several great questions already. I would say, panel, prepare yourself. We might be talking a bit more about seriousness of offences and what we might mean by that, what that might exclude or include, what might be the criteria there. People are interested in some of the pitfalls that have been well identified so far in attempting to reform short sentences, and people interested in how and whether those can be addressed better. Okay, thank you, Cyrus. What I'm going to do now is go across to someone who is known to you all here today. Sarah Armstrong is a professor of criminology at the University of Glasgow. She joins us today via a recorded contribution. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us in person due to problems with her Wi-Fi connection. So she won't be here and able to take part in the Q&A. I know she will be watching the video later on and see your comments there. I also know that her contribution is going to raise a number of questions and issues that we are going to want to, I think, make sure we include in our discussions today. So I will hand over to Sarah's recorded contribution.
So, my name is Sarah Armstrong. I'm from the University of Glasgow, and I am speaking to you via recording via the north of Scotland, where I'm in Assynt in the far northwest. I'm sorry I couldn't join everybody live today, but I am on annual leave, and the cottage I'm in has Wi-Fi, which is not quite as good as I'd hoped or had been assured. And in some ways, though, I thought this aligns well with one of the comments I wanted to make, and that is that sometimes Scotland isn't quite as good as we always think it is, and it deserves some critical scrutiny. In this talk, I really want to raise some questions. I don't have a lot of answers, but I want to raise some questions about short sentence reform. And I begin that first by raising questions about Scotland as a country of progressive penal practice. This is a premise that I'm hoping to challenge. So come for the beaches, but stay for the much needed critical scrutiny of the country and its penalty. I particularly wanted to thank the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies and Helen Mills for putting this panel together with these Scottish colleagues so that we can have a cross-UK discussion about what it means to be progressive and what kinds of reform practices really would lead to a conclusion that what we're doing with our punishment system is enlightened. The argument that Scotland is not particularly progressive is a long one, and it deserves more space than I have time for here, but I just offer a few points to challenge our reputation as a progressive country for punishment. The first is that some people don't realize is we still have IPPs, which we call orders for lifelong restriction. And there's almost no appetite at present to reform these. And at the same time, there's almost nobody who gets out once they've been given one of these orders. We still have the same imprisonment rate as England for both adults and young people, despite extensive amounts of reform and specialist approaches like the children's hearing system. We have a higher rate of prison suicide than England and Wales, despite also having a prison system which over the past 5 or 6 years has fully embraced a more transformative, aspirational, asset-based, strengths-based model of working with prisoners. In fact, I think it's probably more accurate to say that Scottish has a progressive government rather than it has a progressive penal system. And one feature of this government is that it's highly centralized and governs over a relatively small population, which has implications for how quickly reforms can get off the ground or be implemented, and which may limit comparability with other places. If we're talking about the contemporary debate around penal reform, it's worth pointing out that this is not a recent debate, and it has existed almost as long as prisons have existed, since the 1860s. In other words, for over 150 years, people have been trying to get rid of short sentences. And interestingly, it's not just reformers, but governments themselves have seen problems with short sentences. In particular, the consistent line of argument has been is that prisons don't work if people stay in them for less than a year. Even as long ago as the 19th century, the harms of a short prison sentence were given as the loss of family contact, the loss of jobs, and an insufficient period of time to work with the individual to change them for the better. Well, I've spent some time trying to understand this argument and to document the experience of short prison sentences. I'm increasingly interested in the implicit premise on which these claims are based. And that is, if prison doesn't work for people who stay in them in less than a year, then we're also saying that prison does work and is desirable for another group of people, people that we can keep in for longer. And I think this is the crux of my concern, one I think I share with Cyrus Tata, in that are we valorizing or legitimating longer uses of prison by focusing on a short stay problem? So the question I have for discussion today, which unfortunately I can't debate in person, is, are you sure you want to bother with short sentence reform? Scotland provides some evidence which might assist that decision. And the most immediate question that arises is this: do short sentence reforms reduce the use of short sentences? And the answer in Scotland so far has been yes. Since the creation of a presumption against the use of sentences for 3 months or less, there has been a reduction in the use of those sentences. But there's also been evidence of up-tiering, which is an increase in the number of sentences for 4 months or more, and also an increase in net widening, which is not simply the massive increase we've seen in the use of community sentences, but in the increasing number of conditions placed on those sentences and the increased number of hours that those sentences are ordered to be completed in, which has unsurprisingly been accompanied by increasing numbers and rates of breaches of community sentences. Ultimately, though, this reform is motivated by a desire to reduce excessive and unproductive uses of prison. So at the heart of this debate is the question of whether the reduced use of short sentences are also reducing prison populations. The answer from Scotland is unequivocal. No, they do not, and they have not. The creation of a presumption against short prison sentences in Scotland has been accompanied by, or not made any dent in, the long-term increased trend of a rising prison population. A lot of people will say, though, we need to start reform somewhere, and why not here? For a couple of reasons. First, short sentences cause damage to people, people who have not done things that we would consider the worst in terms of criminal harm. And short sentences might be a good place to start, to at least initiate and gain some momentum for reform that might apply and leverage change in other parts of the prison system. My answer to that is, first of all, maybe you're right, is I do think that there are some distinctive damages to doing short sentences, and particularly the way they're done in Scotland, which is doing what is called life by installments, which is cycles of many short sentences over time. And informants and research, including my own, but more recently in Marguerite Schinkel's, is that there are profound harms to going to prison, coming out and going back again, to one's psyche, to one's success, to one's ability to cope. And that this may be experienced as worse than having done one long sentence. However, I want to go back to this premise that short sentences are bad for some people, which means that if some people don't belong in prison, then who precisely are we saying does belong in prison? And I think that debate has to be made more explicit before we can make any decisions about the value of short prison sentence reform. I'm moving towards the conclusion of my remarks already, which is to consider the situation all of us find ourselves in the world over, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic, and what that has done to prisons and within prisons. In Scotland, we're worried about the impact of COVID-19 on spreading cases and producing serious ill health and death, and that has not happened. And in fact, something surprising and unexpected has happened. And that is, we move from this picture we're looking at right now of 20 years of prison growth from 6,000 to 8,000 people to sudden and significant prison population decline. And what we're looking at here is 3 months of lockdown in Scotland, which has wiped out 13 years, the equivalent of 13 years of penal growth. Some of this was produced by early release powers granted in emergency legislation for COVID, but that was the release of people who already were within weeks of their sentence release, sometimes months, and does not account for the full drop. So there's other things going on that will need to be investigated, but the message is clear, is that we've achieved reform without reform. We've achieved the aims of decades of hopes around reducing penal excess in Scotland in just 3 months. I want to then move to another world movement, which has been Black Lives Matter in response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. The killing of George Floyd has reactivated, regenerated, and caused a huge flourishing in the Black Lives Matter movement within the US and globally. It has shifted the language and debates of abolition from radical marginalized spaces to center stage into public, national, mainstream spaces. And that, I think, means that we need to bring it into this space. And it's incumbent on us to try to reckon with how these kinds of debates and the problems that they're responding to are relevant for Scotland and are relevant for the UK and might have some impact on how we think about reform. For me, primarily, the impact on reform is to shift the goals of what we mean by change and what we mean by making a difference. I think that I have been focused, like most people in criminology, on reforming criminal justice by working within criminal justice through sentencing change, through prison policy change. And what's really come to light through the work of Black Lives Matters and the activists affiliated with this movement is that criminal justice change fundamentally is not most effectively or possibly even best handled within criminal justice. It happens outside criminal justice. It happens in social movements where people are demanding not defunding just of police, but of refunding and reinvesting in communities that have been defunded systematically over decades. And in the United Kingdom, we've obviously seen that as part of austerity, and that in addition to fighting for reform of criminal justice, I believe that we ought to be shaping the debates and as criminologists feeding into how we shape reform outside of criminal justice. I conclude now with just 3 points. Is the first, the lesson of Scotland, and that is to beware of success. The reduced use of short sentences, which has been documented here thanks to legislative reform, has not offset the increasing number of prisoners, the increasing population of the prison, or the growing average length of time that prisoners serve here. And that possibly for me ought to be the priority for debate and also reform. And I worry that focusing on removing people at the edges of the prison system is making us more comfortable with the ideas of prisons belonging in society and that we have a need for long-stay institutions of confinement. Secondly, is just to repeat the point that sentence reform, for Scotland anyway, has seemed to be paradoxical. The more we talk about it and the more we act on it, the more we see prison growth. So this is one of the ongoing mysteries to me, is why prison reform is so often accompanied by penal expansion. And it's not a new problem, it's one obviously that Foucault raised at the very start. Finally, I introduced something by way of the conclusion, which is Norway, a country that Scotland has idealized and looked to as a model for its own practices, but where making use of heavy sentences, heavy use of short sentences has been the norm. Is there something that Norway has gotten right with short sentences that we've gotten wrong? That short sentences might be something that we actually allow and support in order to keep the floor low so that the ceiling doesn't go any higher. However, we're also seeing that Norway is experiencing increasing lengths of sentences, and in hopes that they're not copying us and we're hoping to copy them. So anyway, thanks very much for listening. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, and I'm hoping to be a part of future debates and to engage in these issues. And thanks again to the Center for Crime and Justice Studies for organizing this in their project.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, both for that contribution and also for making the time and effort to ensure you could still contribute today. I'm glad you weren't at the end of the road with your laptops kind of stuck in the air trying to find a signal. That was brilliant, thank you. Really nice summary there of some of the issues that I think we're wrestling with, as well as kind of touching on a lot of the wider current agenda around COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. Interesting to turn it on its head there at the end with speaking a bit more about Norway. So should we in fact have more short sentences at the expense of longer sentences? Be interested in whether that's something we want to pick up in the Q&A, which I can see is looking active. It would be great to have some responses to what all our speakers have said so far, and obviously we still have Nicola to go. My advice to question askers rather is if you can do so in the next few minutes, if you can get your question up there, that would be brilliant. We're going to start looking now at what our Q&A looks like, and as we kind of get on, it gets more difficult to try and include everything that's there. So thanks for all your thoughts and questions so far. Some really interesting stuff there to pick up on. I'm going to go to our fourth and final speaker for today. I'm delighted to be introducing Professor Nicola Padfield, who is Professor at the University of Cambridge. Nicola is also a former sentencer herself. She was a court recorder. Many of you will know her work and her regular scrutiny and insight about sentencing developments in England and Wales, including work on the custody threshold and on recall. Nicola, I'm delighted you're able to join us this morning. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I think I've unmuted myself. Thank you. Wonderful to be invited today. Very interesting to think about Scotland, which of course we English frequently forget to do, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to join this discussion. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation because I wanted to respond in some ways to the speakers, and I'm also wanting to respond briefly to one or two questions that Helen encouraged me to think about in advance. The first one was, where are we in terms of an agenda to divert from short-term custody and sentencing reform in England and Wales? To which I laugh. There's no such agenda to do anything like that in this country. And actually, if you want a really good explanation, read Helen's own paper on the Centre for Crime and Justice's website, Stopping Short Sentencing Reform and Short Prison Sentences. I'm certainly not at all convinced that this current government has the slightest interest in cutting short sentences. I'd bring to your attention the consultation, which we were told this Monday has just been launched on doubling maximum sentences for assaulting emergency workers. The press release came out. I still can't find the consultation. The wording of the press release I thought was deeply depressing, talking about how the maximum penalty should be doubled to 2 years behind bars, which didn't seem to me like mature language for government leadership, but there we are. I'd also say straight away at the beginning that I share most of Sarah's nervous reservations that abolishing or strengthening the presumption against short sentences would make a difference. I'll come back to that a little bit more in a minute. Next question from Helen to me was, what should be the government's priorities? Well, that's of course a great fun question. And the first priority, of course, for any government must be to understand the problem. And I've got 4 bullet points on that I'll just mention, and then 4 bullet points I'll just mention on what I think they should do with this understanding. So understanding the problem, well, they've got to understand why people offend, why people re-offend. I think everyone in this audience knows about the age crime curve. Most people stop being criminal on their own initiative. And those who re-offend most tend to be those who've been given short custodial sentences, and we can look at who they are as people and understand why that might be. So that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand, which I do think that politicians and policymakers don't always understand, is that desistance, stopping criminal lifestyle, is a really, really difficult thing. It's often a gradual, a fragile process, and it's strewn with obstacles. I think we who live our comfortable lifestyles need to use a lot more imagination to understand how difficult it can be, why individualized support and mentoring are really important, and why it has been disastrous to decimate probation services in the way that they've been decimated in this country. So that's the second point. The third point is that prisons are ghastly places which disempower and demoralize people and don't increase their life chances. Very basic facts that this government must do. They must read the Chief Inspector of Prisons reports. The Chief Inspector of Prisons won't mind if I say that he's no bleeding heart liberal. If he says what he says about the state of our prisons, we should worry. Tied to that is the size of the prison population, of course. When I was born, which was but yesterday, we had a prison population of 20,000. By 1993, it was 44,000. And I think that that's my personal ambition, to try and reduce our prison population only to the 1993 levels. That seems to me a very modest ambition. By 2016, it had reached 85,000, and last Friday, it was 79,000. England and Wales does not need to have a prison population that size, and we have to recognise what ghastly places they are. Fourth and final learning point for a government, I think, is to really understand the shocking way that the criminal justice system drives social and racial inequality. The most shocking part of Lammy's review, which got a lot of publicity a few years ago, I think is that extraordinary graph which shows you how wonderfully the population of young people, young men in custody, has descended very dramatically in the last 10 years. But look along the bottom, the population of young black men in custody has not shrunk at all. There are huge issues that need to be thought about in that area. So those are my 4 very basic points which I think the government has to understand. How do they act on those understandings? Well, again, 4 bullet points. The first 2 I think are very easy. The second 2 are probably more controversial. The first one is, of course, the government should discourage some prosecutions. We should have more use of community resolutions, deferred prosecutions for individuals, more restorative justice. Of course, I'm nervous about all of that. We have to monitor what the police and the CPS might be doing very clearly, very sophisticatedly, but we also have to be very clear that some people should not be prosecuted. They should be diverted from the criminal justice system. Second, I think very easy learning point is exactly the point that Cyrus was at pains to make. What I've jotted down here is we should get rid of prison as the default position. Partly it's this hierarchy of fines, community orders, prisons. We've got this very odd concept of a custody threshold, which I've written on. I'm sure we should get rid of it. But we've also got to strengthen community penalties. And by that, I don't mean make them tougher. I mean make them more obvious. One of my favourite pieces of shocking research was something that Professor George Mayer published nearly 10 years ago now on the community order, which identified how little probation officers knew about what was available in their areas. So they weren't even recommending community orders to magistrates. Magistrates didn't know about them. It's the ignorance of the those who manipulate the system really didn't understand community orders. So we need to have much better strengthening of awareness and strengthening of community orders in lots of ways. My other two proposals for change are, I think, much more controversial, because my priority, if I was the government, would be to dramatically reduce the prison population. I would do something to reduce all custodial sentences by perhaps 25%. One of the things which is extraordinary in my lifetime is watching not only how more people go to prison, but people go to prison for much, much longer. Why? There's no right sentence. There's no reason to fix sentence lengths that they are at the moment. And my fourth bullet point for how I would act on what I hope the government might understand would be much more active sentence reviews. I see that we've received a question from Judge Samuels on judicial monitoring, and one of the reasons that I support judicial monitoring is the education that it gives to the judges and the sentencers. I think it's really important that those who sentence people understand the implications of the sentences that they serve. It's also really important, for example, that nobody should be in prison for 10 years without there being some clear monitoring of their sentence. So there's a lot to be done in terms of sentencing reviews. I would reverse the burden of proof of the parole board. I could go loads of other places. I'm not actually timing myself, which is a bit naughty. There was a final question from Helen that she threw at me, so after what should be the government's priorities, the final question was, what are the lessons from COVID-19 and what are the potential impact on prison sentencing? Well, I thought I would be a naive academic at this point and be a little bit positive, because I think the pandemic did, to begin with, concentrate minds in various ways which were useful. First of all, at least to begin with in this country, from all quarters, I think there was a humanitarian concern for the well-being of prisoners. I think that was really important. HMPPS is now thinking that this lockdown will continue for a long time and they must be right. Their compartmentalization strategy, which I've seen described as mass institutional solitary confinement. This is no short-term crisis, and we mustn't forget our humanitarian concern for the well-being of prisoners. Another positive that I think came out of the pandemic to begin with was an awareness of the hugely increased weight and pains of imprisonment. The pains of no visits, no association, often 23-hour isolation. Let's not forget the weights and pains of imprisonment. Of course, many people think imprisonment is meant to be ghastly, as I described it earlier. That's fine, but let's not forget the impacts of its ghastliness. And I think the absence of training and education possibilities in prisons for the foreseeable future should really make sentencers question why they're sending people to prison. And the third point, in a sense positive point, that comes out of the pandemic is, I think, again, at least to begin with, there was increased awareness that prisons aren't something apart. They're only partially closed communities. The pandemic can travel between prisons and the wider community, and equally, most people in prison are, of course, coming out. And that's why we should worry about, or one of the reasons why we should worry about the impact of prison on the wider community. Just as I think that there is a public mood at the moment to challenge racism, the legacies of slavery and colonialism, I think there is a strong sense that sentencing shouldn't proceed just as it always has done. So I do think there are positive reasons to think that we could take a message from COVID-19 to do something to significantly improve the system. But to go back to where I started, do I see it reflected in the government's agenda at this moment? No, I most certainly don't. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you for taking on the challenges, I suppose, that I set you, and ending on such positive notes as well. Okay, I'm going to quickly move across actually to our questions and question session, because we have a lot of questions there, and I'd like to try to get through as many as we can. The first one I'm going to be asking, because it's been posted anonymously, and that question is a nice clear question: should we be bolder and make some offences not subject to prison sentences at all? Kenny, I'm going to come to you first, if I may.
I mean, I think being bold is necessary, or you won't get anywhere. Scotland is slightly different. I mean, I agreed with what Cyrus and Sarah and others were saying. I mean, there's a progressive government, certainly not a progressive penal policy at the moment, but you can only, you know, go at a particular pace. But you do have to lead from the front. But equally, you do lead from the front, people stand by you. I do agree with Cyrus as well, that at some stage you've just got to say we're not sending them to prison for that. You've got to make sure that the alternatives are there. So at some stage, you know, if the Lord Justice Clerk cannot deliver, then the government is going to have to be bold and just say we are saying that you cannot do it. If he can't enforce it amongst his junior Shrivel members, then it's going to have to come in. So the bottom line is, the answer to that is yes. You know, if you don't do it, then you will be dictated to by the Mail or the Express, which have a bigger influence in south of the border than they do in Scotland. I mean, the newspapers are dying, you know, so it can be done, and you just got to do it.
Well, this may be putting you on the spot, so I'm sure there's an elegant way out. Do you want to name a few offences that you think shouldn't be subject to a prison sentence at all?
Well,
are you comfortable about saying that?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, that's not for me to decide. I mean, I think it's most ones that would get a short sentence. I mean, shoplifting, things, unless it's organised, you know, serious offending there. I mean, all these crimes, as Cyrus said, of poverty, I do much prefer leaving it to the judiciary, but they've got to deliver, you know, and that's why I've always, you know, kept off, you know, enforcement, but they've got to deliver. And I do think they're getting better. But I think at the end of the day, the best thing is not so much to go on specific offences. It's the period of sentence that is the concern. And again, I think Cyrus and Sarah touched upon it. You don't want to get up tariffing. That was always a worry about that we had, you know, going for 3 months or 6 months, that you would just get 9 months rather than 6 months. I think you've just got to say that prison isn't going to be for, you know, short periods of sentence. There will always be the risk that somebody who would have got 9 months is going to get a year. But rather than the offence, I think it has to be the going to prison, full stop, because you know, there's always some instances, you know, as I say, shoplifting is viewed as minor, but there are gangs of shoplifters, etc. So you know, you've got to vary it. So I think it's I tend to go more on the period rather than the particular offence. But you know, I think I'm open-minded.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Nicola, if I can come to you next and ask you the same question: should we be bolder and make some offences not subject to a prison sentence at all? And I don't know if there's anything you want to say there in terms of what Kenny was saying about whether we should be going on the period of time spent in custody or the type of offence.
One of the things which I think is really interesting is the fact that the government wants to talk about, for example, in the consultation, which may or may not have been launched on Monday, about 2-year sentences. Well, most people who get a 2-year sentence in this country would come out of prison after 10 months. And there are some really interesting issues about the revolving door of the prison, I think, which we have to talk about. The huge increase in recall, this nonsensical to me post-sentence supervision that we have to think about. So I see that one of the questions is about the binary between custody and community, and I think that's a really, really important difference. I would like to make many more approved premises and call them open prisons, and then some of the people on short sentences would never actually go to custody, but that's probably another story. I don't think that I would want to ban at this stage custody for many offences, because I do think we need to individualise sentencing and see what people have done and the context in which they have done it. So again, to think about those who assault emergency workers. If there are people who are deliberately assaulting emergency workers for no good reason, I think it's really difficult to think about what the punishment should be. I suspect that most of those who assault emergency workers are either drunk or on drugs or very angry for reasons that it would be interesting to know about, maybe mentally ill. There are lots and lots of reasons, and I don't think there's been any studies done as to why people are assaulting emergency workers. So let's understand a bit more before we increase the length of sentences. I'm not prepared today, therefore, in answer to your question, to say there are these crimes. Of course, non-payment of TV licenses, huge array of things which are ridiculous to send people to prison. So I could create the list if you wanted me to, but I think I need more notice of it.
Oh, yes, please. Okay, Cyrus, I'm going to come to you next with the same question. You need to unmute, Cyrus.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks very much to the anonymous member of the audience for a really nice question. What I like about your question is that you flip the term. So often we ask the question, what should prison be for? You're asking the question instead, what should prison not be for? Actually, I part company with Kenny on this as well, that about whether or not we should be using the category of time as opposed to the seriousness of the case. I've always thought that what we should be trying to do is to focus on this as a matter of proportionality rather than time. So what kinds of cases as a society are we saying should normally be non-imprisonable? And we've done this before, and but it is the kind of detailed work, I think, that, for instance, an NGO or indeed a sentencing council is very well equipped to do. It's not something that can be done overnight in terms of a list, but one can do that to say, normally these are the sorts of things we would expect. You could do it partly through guideline judgments, if monitored, in terms of compliance and so on. But I come back to the point, this is not something you can just implement, because immediately one can hear, and rightly, the sentencing judges and practitioners saying, but wait a minute, those so-called alternatives just aren't there. So that comes back to my point about saying we need a long-term plan. We need a kind of penal change date, just like we've got a climate change date, to say this is where we're aiming. And by this date, we are not going to be sending certain kinds of people to prison unless their offending demands it. So that's what I would do. I would say it needs that kind of detailed work, and we need a target date.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. We have several people here who have knowledge and expertise around women who are in contact with the criminal justice system in particular. And a question from one of them now, if I can hand over to Lisa Danzo.
Hi, Helen. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. Thank you to all the panelists for their really interesting presentations and debate. My sort of interest really is the tension between ideology and evidence. I think, Cyrus, you talked to the the issues around how we can use the evidence to advocate for us in terms of the effectiveness of community alternatives. And as the director of a women's centre, I have to say that there are sort of huge frustrations around this within the women's sector generally, because we've worked incredibly hard to actually advocate for and prove the effectiveness of women-centred interventions in terms of reducing reoffending, including things like Justice Data Lab information, which we've been very involved in collating. And despite all of that evidence and this being backed up by the female offender strategy in relation to that, we're still seeing a less than robust take-up of community alternatives through women's centres. So I'm just curious really as to the panelists' thoughts on what we do around combating the ideology, which seems to be the thing that sort of holds us back, despite having the evidence that proves that alternatives do work really well.
Thank you, Lisa. I could see Cyrus nodding along there. So Cyrus, if I could come to you and just ask our panelists just to keep your comments short, just so we can get through a few more questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Lisa. Just listening to you and also seeing your question on screen, if I could also tie it in with the question from Professor Andrew Ashworth, who has looked at this for many, many years. I think you're also asking about persistent offenders and the problem of so-called persistent offenders. What do you do there, even if the immediate instant offence isn't serious? I think it comes back to two things. One is, do we understand sufficiently, including in terms of research, why people don't comply? What research that has been done around compliance shows all kinds of issues there. And secondly, the importance of continuity of judicial contact. And one of the nice things about so-called community courts, problem-solving courts, is that it encourages that, or judicial reviews. I wonder if I've answered the question, though, sufficiently, because I'm kind of looking also at the textual questions on the screen. Helen, you can tell me.
Yes, you have. Thank you very much. I am going to move on to the next question, just because we do have quite a few lined up. Can I move on to Peter Conlon, who has a question? And sorry, I should have said this earlier. When you're asking a question, please could you introduce yourself and just say just a brief who you are. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. It's Peter Conlon here. I'm from Justice Analytical Services in the Scottish Government. I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts are on what we should do with people who've committed serious offences, but who don't necessarily pose a long-term risk to the public. Things like death by dangerous driving, perhaps. And where does punishment and retribution fit in?
Sounds like a big question to me. Okay, Nicola, can I come to you?
Yes.
Oh, and you need to unmute, Nicola.
I think that you certainly can come to me. I think there are really big questions that we have to talk about those sorts of long sentences. You choose causing death by dangerous driving. I think the aiding and abetting sentences are astonishingly long. Those who aid and abet murder, who may not have done anything themselves, is a huge national scandal, as many people know. Young men who went along with other young men who end up murdering someone, getting 20-year minimum terms. So we do have to think very hard about what we mean by punishment and what we mean by retribution, and the role of the victim, I think, is an extraordinarily difficult point. If I can be a bit naughty, also to include in my answer a reference to Lisa Dando, who got slightly short shrift in answer to her question, because I thought it was a brilliant question. She raised what I wished I had been able to explain a bit more about this lessons between the tension between ideology and evidence. My 4 learning points for the government was start by learning, start by understanding what's happened to women in the penal system is really shocking. Lady Corsten said it all in 2007, and we have the female offenders strategy, but actually the funding for so many wonderful initiatives have been cut and cut. So it's again the mismatch in all these things between what people say and what they do, what they pay for. So I'll shut up and let somebody else have an answer.
Brilliant. Good to get two answers in there. Impressive stuff. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next question as we approach our last 10 minutes of this webinar, and that is from John Samuels.
I'm John Samuels, and I used to sit in the Crown Court as a judge for some 27 years, one way or another. Nikki has trailed the question that I would like to put, which is, will judicial monitoring, namely the continued involvement of sentences in the lives of those whom they have sentenced, help to achieve the elimination, or at least the significant reduction, of short custodial sentences? Of course, I agree completely with the extent to which judicial monitoring will educate all sentences in the conditions of those serving sentences. But my question goes rather further than that and asks whether or not sentences will, by continuing to involve themselves in the sentenced lives of those whom they've sentenced, actually cause a reduction in the sentenced population. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, John. So will sentences being involved post-sentencing decisions have any impact on reducing the short-term prison population, our subject of today? Nicola, you teed this up, so I'm going to come to you first on this one.
I think the answer is that we don't know the answer to that question. And one of the issues which is really important, which I meant to pick up from what Kenny said, which is really important, is the real vital importance of judicial training and education. And judges can, of course, talk each other up to get tougher, but they can also talk each other to try and understand a bit better what's going on in the penal system. So Kenny spoke very, very positively about judicial training in Scotland, about which I know nothing, but I certainly would want to see a big focus in this country, much more on the causes of crime and what works to reduce reoffending, whereas judges don't tend to think about those issues in judicial training in England and Wales. So whether the judicial involvement would reduce sentences, who knows? I hope that it would lead to more understanding. I certainly think deferred sentences are a good thing. I think that drugs courts have certainly been proven in some places to be effective. Too often I fear, again, it's resources which stop people, stop governments wanting to encourage them more, because one of the big problems here is interagency cooperation, interagency working together with people who are persistently committing crimes. And one thing we're not at all good at in this country is interagency cooperation. It takes time, it depends on individuals working well together, and it takes money.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Kenny, if I could bring you in now, as Nicola said, you did mention in your presentation earlier about the importance of judicial education in Scotland as part of the changes around the presumption. So I wonder, following on from that, what you make of this question about...
Well, I think, the short answer is yes, it can. I mean, drug courts that Nicola referred to, I mean, I always remember Frank Mulholland, the Lord Advocate, saying, well, actually, every court should really be a problem-solving court. And I have to say the things that I've seen, both as a practitioner and indeed as a politician, in terms of the judiciary trying to encourage, but holding the sword of Damocles or whatever over their head, work remarkably effectively. What became quite clear from the McCaskill Commission is when courts work constructively, that's where they work well. I do remember meeting some sheriffs who, would be outraged if somebody was referred back to them. They wouldn't cooperate with the social work department. Equally, it was quite clear from the McCaskill Commission that went and looked at our sentencing from the courts that work best were where sheriffs would phone up the social worker and say, I've got this individual, what can you provide that I can sentence him to or whatever. How can we work together? You do get sheriffs who say it's not my job, I'm not speaking to them, and they were dysfunctional ones. So as I say, what you really need is to, I think, what works well in many instances is for the presiding judge to have some control over that individual so they can monitor, because we are dealing with people who have dysfunctional lives and they need support, and that was coming from that. But the judiciary need to cooperate with the other aspects. Where that works well, and Falkirk was a place I think I always remember worked remarkably well. Other areas, in particular Aberdeen, were dysfunctional. So I think my view is yes, it does work. It doesn't work in every instance, but you know, I also do subscribe to the view that courts should be problem-solving courts.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that. So far, two kind of cautiously positive responses. Cyrus, I'm going to have to ask you to be quite brief, but I know that you have quite a lot to say on judicial discretion and involvement in sentencing decisions. So if I could ask you if you're also cautiously positive?
This is in terms of judicial contact with the person sentenced. Yeah, I think that was a very astute question, as one would expect from the questioner. Yeah, I mean, as Nikki said, well, I think the first instinctive reaction is it should help. One would think it should help, but there's been fairly little research. What research there has been, I think, suggests it does have, that kind of contact does have a helpful effect in terms of familiarising the decision maker with the person's life.
Brilliant, thank you, and thank you for being brief. I'd now like to go to a question from Cara Jardine, please.
Good morning, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I'm Cara Jardine, I'm from the University of Strathclyde. I'd like to say thanks to all the panellists. I've really enjoyed this morning having this cross-border perspective. And I was really interested in what Kenny was saying about how in Scotland, when we introduced the presumption against short sentences, we also rebranded all of our community orders in terms of payback to make them sound more powerful perhaps and to bring the public on board. And I've always been interested in and puzzled by why we then also introduced, or we got rid of automatic early release for long-term prisoners, because to me it seems that that just has a really negative effect, and that the people with the most need and have the most problem progressing through their sentence get the least support and supervision in the community. And I was wondering if the panel felt that was symptomatic maybe of a similar sort of effort to give a really simple message to the public about crime, that you will serve the sentence that you served, and that is a very clear headline that you can communicate. And whether the broader implication of that means we need to be a bit more imaginative and a bit more radical about how we engage with the public to avoid sort of unintended consequences of simple messaging, and maybe trust the public to be a bit more thoughtful or reflective or understanding around some issues around criminal justice and sentencing.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Cara. I'm going to come to Kenny first. Can you resolve this puzzle about why early release, why the changes around early release?
I mean, it wasn't done by me. It was done as soon as I was out of office. I refused to do it. I was occasionally challenged by the former First Minister about why don't you do it, because the only people pushing it were the Daily Mail and the Tories. And it comes and goes. But I have to say, I think it was a shameful decision. I regret that the Scottish Government is down that route. It is causing a real problem both for them now and indeed for future administrations, because as it's being referred to, I think correctly, prison numbers are down due to COVID, but they're going to go rocketing up. So there was no need to do it, and I think that was where there should have been a bit of political courage. You know, there is a logical argument that the sentence given should be the sentence served, but actually the judiciary knew what they were sentencing to. The public at the end of the day don't care. And it comes back to the problem I think we've all been touching upon. We sadly live in a much more retributive society. So some of this is not just what we do penologically, it's how we deal with this socially. Because, you know, sentences have been ramping up ever since I was first involved in the legal profession.
Brilliant, thank you very much for that, Kenny.
Could I take a brief issue with that? Because
I was just coming to you, Nicola, please do. I'm
not sure that we do live in a more retributive society. It depends what you mean by the public and who they are, and our understanding of public responses to crime are very, well, often very simplistic. You know, is it the Daily Mail Or is it people who are the victims of crime who understand what's going on in their neighbourhoods? There is this real problem that when this government in this country at this moment engages with the public, they appear to be engaging with a very small number of the public. A debate like this gets people who are not so punitive. So the public is a really difficult concept, and the more people know about criminal justice issues and about prisons, I think the less punitive they are. So that is about honest communication from policymakers too. And the other part of that question, which I wanted very briefly to respond to, was when we talk about early release, what do we mean? I certainly think that everybody should have early release and some kind of supervised release into the community. And the big question is about discretionary early release and whether we have the rules right on that. But that's probably a question for another day.
Cyrus, I'm going to give you the opportunity now just to come in on this question, if you would do so for 1 minute. Thank you.
I will keep my comments brief. I was an outspoken critic of the bill that went through on the control of the release of prisoners in Scotland. I don't need to rehearse that. I certainly was off the minister's Christmas card list at the time. That's Kenny's successor. And for that, I do think we badly need to look at the ways in which we both sentence front door and back door, but you have to do it together. I think this has been the mistake of successive governments, thinking you can do one bit and not the other bit. You have to look at it together. I understand actually people's cynicism around it, the sense of dishonesty, but at the same time, it is possible to marry that with the need for, when someone's been institutionalized for many years, support and supervision upon release. So it is possible to do, but you have to look at it in the round.
Brilliant, thank you. That was exactly a minute. Okay, that is all we have time for this morning, and I am sorry for that. It feels like we're just getting going on a lot of these topics, and I would love to be sat here for another hour at least unpicking them, but not today, I'm afraid. Apologies to those who had questions that we did not get to. The slides you've seen this morning from Cyrus, if he's happy to share them, we will be sharing them with you next week. We will also be sharing a recording of this event. We will also be sending you asking for your feedback about today. That is really helpful for us in planning our work. I think that will actually be going out to you on Monday. If you could spare a minute, it's very short, to complete it, it will really help us. So all that's really left me to do is to say thank you. Thank you to our panel today for all of their brilliant contributions and candour and getting stuck in this morning. I really appreciate that. And thank you to you all for joining us, to listening and to taking part and asking some brilliant questions. Thank you.
Okay, that's everyone gone?
I'm having a problem starting my video again. You can't start your video because your host has stopped it.
Hang on a sec. Try again.
There we go, got it now. Thanks, guys. Brilliant. Are any of our panel still here?
I'm here, but it says to me that the host has said I can't use my video.
I'm here as
Whatever
well.
someone just did to me, could you